Well, today we are going to embark on a journey that answers a question of what do we do in difficult times? Essentially, what do we do when bad things happen? Now, James chapter 1 tells us that we are to rejoice. When we face trials and persecutions and suffering, we are to rejoice. No one likes that. No one really gets happy when they face difficulties. But the problem is something like James chapter 1 has led us to conclusions that we just need to pretend everything is okay. That when we face trials and difficulties, we say, well, don't express our emotions. Don't express our difficulties. Don't express what we're going through. Just pretend it's okay. Now, when we suppress what we're going through, then really what we're doing is we're preventing other people from actually knowing us. And usually what happens is then we have this atmosphere of misery and isolation. We've told people don't talk about it. Don't express, don't moan and groan. Don't be a whiner. Those are things that have been spoken into us. But we're going to come to the book of Job. And we're going to spend most of the summer on the book of Job. And it sounds a lot more daunting than it is, I promise you. All right? The book of Job basically answers the question of what do we do when bad things happen? What do we do when difficulties happen? Now, Job is part of the wisdom literature section in the Bible. It is the first. It's the first book that begins the wisdom literature section. It's Job and Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. And some of it has, we have good phrases, good sayings, but it's about our emotions and our inmost beings. See, these books express the full gamut of emotions, from sorrow to joy to heartache to victory. But the book of Job specifically deals with the question of theodicy. And that's not a word we typically use, but theodicy, it asks the question, if God is good and all-powerful and all-loving, why does he allow bad things to happen to good people? That's the question. And that's a question that we struggle with. Why do bad things happen to good people? Or we can also ask, why do good things happen to bad people? If I'm faithful to God, why doesn't he take care of me? Why don't things work out better for me? Now, Job himself is a bit of an odd character because when the book was written, he isn't a typical protagonist. He's not the hero of the story that you would expect from this time period. He's not particularly crafty. He's not particularly cunning. He's not a warrior or anything like that. He just seems like this person that happened to get caught in the crossfires. Now, he was extremely wealthy, and we'll get into that in a minute, but he's not the typical hero of the story. But what happens is that Job encounters God and is profoundly changed. That's really what happens in the book. Now, I say that's what happens in the book. Most of the book isn't about that. It's about his journey. It's about his journey to encounter God. A lot of times we see the story and we want the end of the story, but we forget that story was a really long journey. So when we're dealing with questions of why do bad things happen to good people, we can give surface level answers or we can sit in the difficulty. We can take time to stay there. Not bask in the difficulty, but allow the difficulty to fully be processed. And that's what the book of Job does for us. And so we're going to look at the first two chapters today. And the first two chapters are kind of a story setup for what happens in the rest of the book. So in Job chapter 1, verse 1, there was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He also had many servants. He was, in fact, the richest person in that entire area. Job's sons would take turns preparing feasts in their homes, and they would also invite their 3 sisters to celebrate with them. When these celebrations ended, sometimes after several days, Job would purify his children. He would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. For Job said to himself, "Perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular practice. Now, the land of Uz, scholars kind of saying this is probably the area of Edom, which is southwest of Israel. That's the typical area where they think it may be somewhere in that area. But Job was just living his normal life, unaware that he was getting ready to become the center of a spiritual battle. He is kind of ground zero. Now, it says that Job is blameless. He is lacking nothing. This does not mean he is sinless. It's that he is mature in character. He is straight in conduct. He is perfect in integrity. He is a person without duplicity. That's who Job is. Who he says he is who he is. You see an authentic version of himself. Now, there are people I know that are authentic, but they are not blameless. They are unashamedly who they are, but they may not be a very good person. But Job was unashamedly who he was, and he was a good person, a kind person, a generous person. That's who Job is. But he's also the wealthiest person. He was rich. I don't know how we would quantify the amount of livestock he had for today, but even if he had 7,000 sheep today, that's just crazy amounts. I don't know where you keep them all and all that kind of stuff and the logistics of all that. But Job was incredibly wealthy. He had more than anybody else. But Job loved God more than he loved money. That's a key principle that's going to come up as we look at Job. Now, some of your versions may talk about in the east or talk about Job in the east. That's the literal translation. But in this context, and when this is written, east kind of means before. So the sun rises in the east, so it's like east is that way if you really want to get specific. I just randomly point. But before. So this is happening at a time before. We don't necessarily know when that was or what the context was. There's different theories of when Job was, who his contemporaries were. But Job is the richest person in the world or in the area, and he really loves God. Now we're going to get to a point here. We're going to continue in chapter 1 where the question is, will Job bless God or will Job curse God? Now an interesting thing about the Hebrew that's written in is the word curse is never used. Essentially, it's saying, will Job bless God or will Job bless God? That because the word blessed is used, it's the same word is used to say, is he going to bless God or is he going to curse God? And we do this with our language as well. And we have, if somebody does something really nice to you, you can say, oh, thank you. And you can genuinely say thank you. If someone does something that's kind of mean, you can say, well, thanks a lot. Right? That's what's happening here. It's will Job legitimately bless God or will he reject God? That's what's happening here as we come to verse 6. Because one day members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the area. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosperous in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. One day, Job's sons and daughters were feasting at the oldest brother's house. A messenger arrived at Job's home with this news. Your oxen were plowing, with donkeys feeding beside them. When the Sabaeans raided us, they stole all the animals and killed all the farmhands. I'm the only one left who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. The fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up your sheep and all the shepherds. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, a third messenger arrived with this news. 3 bands of Chaldean raiders have stolen your camels and killed your servants. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. Your sons and daughters were feasting in the oldest brother's home. Suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the wilderness and hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed and all your children are dead. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. He said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin by blaming God. So that's the first test. If there's a first test in the place, there's a second test, but pretty intense. A lot happened in that. But the scene is started by we have essentially the heavenly court has convened. God is there, the angels are coming, and then we have Satan or the accuser who is there. But one thing that we need to remember with the book of Job that it shows us is that God is in control even when chaos terrorizes. Job didn't know what was going on. We see from this side of the story, we see the heavenly court scene and that God is in control. So when Satan comes in this moment, we see that God is the one who's really in charge. Now, in the Old Testament concept of Satan is not as developed as ours. So the word that is used is more closely translated as examiner or accuser or adversary. That when your translations use the word Satan, that's the word that's actually being used there. And so there are theories that maybe this wasn't actually Satan, the demonic force that we think of. Maybe there's an angel that God has assigned as this one who is to test humanity, to test us so that we could be strengthened. Now, God doesn't test us so we sin. He tests us to strengthen us. And I think one of the issues is we don't like that because we don't like to be tested. We have a sense of entitlement that if I am uncomfortable, God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? It's hard for us to fathom that God would allow us to be uncomfortable so that we would grow. That's a difficulty for us to wrap our minds around. But in this scene, we see that God is sovereign. God is on the throne, but the examiner has access to God somehow. Whether it's Satan himself or some other being, we don't know exactly, but the examiner has access to God's throne, and God has found no fault with Job, but the examiner found no fault with Job. Neither one found fault with Job, but the examiner questioned it. Now, one thing that's interesting is that the examiner did not ask God for Job. God offered Job to the examiner. Don't like that either. Because it's like I don't want God to offer me for testing. I don't want to endure the difficulty that then brings perseverance, that then brings growth. I just want to grow. That's what we want. And so some of it is there's some uncomfortable things happening here that we just don't like. We're Americans. If we're uncomfortable, we're going to find a solution to make ourselves comfortable. That's how we function. Let's be real. The air conditioning was not working in the West Wing this morning. It was obnoxious. Right? And like we had there, like we're like, should we move classrooms today? Should we do this? Should we do because we're uncomfortable? How can we adjust our circumstances in order to be comfortable? That's how we function. I hope we understand that. Like I hope we have awareness to realize that we feel we are entitled to ease or comfort. That when we suffer, we protest. But one of the things that happens here that's really important is that God is in control. God limits the power of the examiner. God offers Job and says, you can only do this much. And there's no question. There's no back and forth. There's no, we'll see about that. As a matter of fact, the examiner only had so much authority that God allowed him to have. Now, that authority was pretty big. All the animals, all the livestock, all of Job's kids were killed or taken away. Some of the livestock were stolen. But only one person survived to tell the story. That's how all of it unfolds. But verse 20 to 22, Job did not sin. He didn't pretend everything was okay, but he did worship God. He took a step back and said, you know what? God gave. I had a ton of blessings, but God took away. And he trusted in God in this moment. He didn't know why it was happening, didn't really understand the ramifications of what was going on, but Job blessed God, legitimately blessed God. He didn't bless God, he blessed God. He worshiped him. But then we come to chapter 2, and we find one day the members of a heavenly court came again to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser Satan came with them. Where have you come from, the Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. And he has maintained his integrity, even though you urged me to harm him without cause. Satan replied to the Lord, skin for skin. A man will give up everything he has to save his life. But reach out and take away his health, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, do with him as you please, the Lord said to Satan, but spare his life. So Satan left the Lord's presence, and he struck Job with terrible boils from head to foot. Job scraped his skin with a piece of broken pottery, and he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die. But Job replied, you talk like a foolish woman. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad? So in all this, Job said nothing wrong. So this was the second test. The beginning part is a repeat of the first scene of the heavenly court convenes, and the examiner comes and talks with God, and they have heavenly court. And what the examiner essentially questions is that Job needs to be tested in his wholeness. Not just his stuff, but his body and mind all need to be tested. It's not enough for the external things to be taken away. Now, I get his children are somewhat internal, like that. That's hopefully he was more connected to his kids than his camels, but hopefully we are more connected to our family than we are with our material possessions. But the examiner said we need to test even Job himself, his body and his mind, the wholeness of Job. But remember, God is still in control. He sets a limit for what the examiner is able to do. So this gives us hope and helps us rest in the truth that even when chaos terrorizes, God is in control. That's a truth we can cling to, a truth we can come back to. You see, Job affirms, he already affirmed that God gives and he takes away. That's difficult for us. But what Job does is he rejects the prosperity gospel. And the prosperity gospel is essentially saying, if I follow God, if I'm faithful to God, he will give me worldly blessings. So if I do this for God, he will do this over here. We may not be able to control exactly what he does over here, but we'll be able to measure it on some way. That we can quantify, I'm faithful to God over here, and so God's going to give me this. And Job says that's not how it works. Job's going to praise God because God gives and God takes away. We may not fully understand it, but we trust that God knows what he's doing. But Job had nothing left, and he was covered in boils. Job's appearance was just terrible. I don't know what it would look like to be covered in boils, and I hope I never do. But he just looked like a miserable person that all you could do is have pity for him. You felt sorry for him. Now, there are people that we may have encountered in life that we feel sorry for them. But Job was the wealthiest man in the area, and now he has nothing. He's scraping his boils with pottery. He has nothing left. It's just terrible, sad, miserable scene because everything has been taken away from him. And when I say everything, I mean everything. His wife enters the scene. And I think we need to be careful not to condemn his wife and speak overly harsh of his wife, well, she wasn't very supportive of him. I mean, like, she was going through things too, right? Her livelihood's gone. Her kids were killed. Don't forget that she was enduring things, and we don't seem to give her any sympathy. But what's happening is everything in Job's life is being taken away from him, including his spouse. The examiner is able to attack everything in Job's life. And the examiner can use all sorts of things in life to tempt us, even those close to us. Sometimes those closest to us can be our biggest source of temptation because they have our best interest in mind, but maybe they're not fully aligned with Jesus. But I do want to pause for a moment as we talk about marriages and remind us that your spouse likely draws more emotional support from you than you realize. While we don't want to condemn Job's wife, we do want to say, make sure we don't act like Job's wife. That we don't act, that's not how we are as a spouse. Because the examiner assaulted Job by making him feel abandoned by his spouse. That's really hard. Now he lost all of his material possessions, lost all of his kids, and lost the love of his spouse. That's where Job is. That's where we're finding him, sitting in ashes, scraping himself with broken pottery. What a terrible first 2 chapters of the Bible, of a book of the Bible. Like, just, it's hard to stomach. Like, if you think, now, you're not as, unless you're secretly, I don't know, you're not as wealthy as Job, okay? You're not a hidden Elon Musk or something like that. But if you lost everything, how would you feel if everything was just taken away from you? And that's such a big thing. It's hard for us really to actually articulate how we would feel. It's hard for us to fully express that. But there's a few more verses in chapter 2. In verse 11, when 3 of Job's friends heard of the tragedy he had suffered, they got together and traveled from their homes to comfort and console him. Their names were Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. When they saw Job from a distance, they scarcely recognized him. Wailing loudly, they tore their robes and threw dust into the air over their heads to show their grief. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and nights. No one said a word to Job, for they saw that his suffering was too great for words. So these 3 friends are going to play a big role in the next 25 chapters or so in the book of Job. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. We really don't know much about them. There are some theories that scholars have, but all we know is they come to Job and they talk to Job. That's really about all we know. Some think they traveled a long distance, but they have dialogue, a back and forth with Job. They start with empathy, but they end with condemnation. That's really where it moves to. But the beginning of it is something I think we can learn from. Because they saw Job and they sat with Job. I said earlier, sometimes when we go through difficulties, we need to take time to sit in it, to allow ourselves to fully process it. But there are times, one thing we need is we need someone to sit with us. That's a really important thing. And it's both really difficult to sit in with someone else, and it's also a huge privilege to do it. If someone allows you to do it, asks you to do it, don't take that for granted. Sit with them. And most of the time, people don't need you to speak. They just need you to be there. That's the reality of it. If someone's going through a crazy difficult time, they need your physical presence. They need to know you care. They don't need to know your opinion or your insights or your suggestions to help them solve all their problems. They just need to know that you care, that you are willing to sit with them there. And came across this concept recently that talked about how the courage we have is, in many cases, externally driven. So if someone is going to jump out of a plane, skydiving, they have courage to do so because they have a parachute attached to their back. They have an external thing that says, I can do this. It's not just they are there by themselves, have no support, and they're just going, I'm just going to jump on a plane, it's okay. No, I've got a parachute that's going to make it okay. Most people, all they need is someone to believe in them. Someone to say, even if all this goes south, I am still here with you. If somebody has one person in their life that is willing to do that for them, then they can have courage to do anything. Psychologically speaking, that's what we need. We need someone to say that even if everything goes wrong and bad and is destroyed, I'm not going to leave. Because when we have somebody that we know is going to support us, that gives us great courage. But the friends sit there for 7 days, and they're in silence for 7 days. That's a long time. I mean, try sitting in silence for 7 minutes with somebody. That can be a long time. Without your phone. Put your phone away and sit in silence for 7 minutes with somebody. And that's a long time. But they sat in silence for 7 days, and there are different reasons we can say, why were they doing that? Maybe they just didn't know what to say. They were just so overwhelmed by how terrible the situation was, they didn't know what to say. Maybe they were trying to make sense of it all. They were trying to figure out what was going on, or how they could be helpful, or how they could just do something. Now, there's a thought, there's some etiquette at the time, that when somebody was mourning, when you went to sit with them, the etiquette required that you would be quiet until they spoke. So maybe for 7 days, Job didn't speak, and they're just sitting there bored out of their mind. Well, we can't talk until he says something. Whatever it is, they were willing to take 7 days to just sit there. And while the next 25 chapters or so, they're not painted in a great picture, I want to make sure we give them some credit. They came to be with their friend, and they sat there with him. They gave terrible advice, but they came. And sometimes that's all that's needed, just for you to be there, just for you to be present. Job suffered greatly. Then the rest of the book is about the processing journey of what that looks like, of how Job went through that, what Job's journey took him through. And it requires patience, but patience and suffering requires that we have an eternal perspective or an eternal focus. If this life is meaningless, then suffering is to be avoided at all costs. But if we have a future hope, which we do because of Jesus, then we can patiently endure suffering, not looking forward to suffering, not seeking suffering, but we can endure it because we trust that God is in control. See, Job knew what happened, but he had no idea why. We see why. We see the story. We see the heavenly courtroom scene. We see the cosmic battle that is happening here. But Job doesn't. And the reality, and almost every time you suffer in life, you don't get to know why. Maybe afterwards you might know why. But as you're suffering, you often don't know why. Why am I going through this? Why does this have to happen? Why is God allowing this in my life? The book of Job walks us through how do we deal with these questions without just making it surface level, without saying, well, we just trust God, He's in control, and He'll work everything out in the end. While that's true, sometimes that can feel awfully shallow. Because what Job does is Job expresses his anguish. He expresses his sorrow. He expresses his distress and the deep agony that he goes through. Not in a way that is indignant towards God, not in a way that rejects God, not in a way that blames God, but in a way that says, this is really, really hard. And I think we often try to skip that step. We try to say, well, we're experiencing suffering. We got to consider it pure joy and act like everything's okay. That's not what Job does. Job takes time to sit in the difficult. Not in a way that just wallows in self-pity, but in a way that asks the difficult questions of how can I really obey God when I don't feel it? How can I obey God and be faithful to God when all these terrible things are happening to me? Because we see the story that the trials Job went through were to silence the examiner. Or say that Job really does love God more than his worldly possessions, more than his health, more than anything. Job loves God because this was first and foremost a spiritual battle in the heavenly realms that was displayed in the earthly life of Job. It was a spiritual battle that came down to earth to be displayed and to be decided. God allowed Job to be suffered. God allowed Job to suffer. But that does not mean God delighted in Job suffering. God allows us to suffer. That does not mean God is happy and joyful and gleeful when you suffer. We don't always understand why, and most of the times we don't. But as we go through the book of Job this summer, I want to challenge you to take time to sit in the difficulty that is suffering. Sit in the difficulty that is, I don't know why this has happened. I don't know why this is being allowed. I can say, even when chaos terrorizes, God is in control, but don't skip the journey. Don't skip the process. Because if you skip the journey, then you're allowing yourself to ask shallow questions, to get shallow answers, and to really not have the depth that God wants you to have. The point of trials is not for you to skip to the right answer at the end. The point of trials is for you to grow in depth and perseverance and in character. I'm sure there's other reasons God may allow trials in our life. But we're talking about trials, not punishment here. Job wasn't punished. Job was blameless. He was doing everything right. He was following God with everything he had, and yet bad things still happened to him. And oftentimes our language is lacking. To say bad things happened to Job doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what he endured. And that may be true for you in certain circumstances. There may be things that you've endured that calling it bad or calling it suffering doesn't begin to explain it. And the point is not that we have to have the words to fully articulate it, but we have to allow ourselves to feel it. We have to take time to sit in the difficult. So that's what we're going to do this summer. And I believe it's worth it. Because if you've read the book of Job, if you know, not the last few verses, but if you know the conclusion Job comes to. Because God takes care of everything in the end. The story is good, but the journey is where we grow. The journey is the depth of the book of Job, of how do we stand on the truth and process the pain at the same time, while also submitting to God who knows infinitely more than we can even begin to understand. That's where Job takes us. That's our journey.